40 rings at that church. It did not feel dramatic. It felt inconvenient, almost shameful, as though I had interrupted something sacred with my weakness. 1 second the choir was holding the final note of the hymn, sunlight pouring through stained glass in deep blues and reds, warming the wooden pews and the backs of folded hands, and the next my fingers slipped from the bench because the strength in them had quietly disappeared. I remember thinking, not here, please not here, because I have always believed that if you are going to fall apart, you should at least do it privately. But the floor rose too fast for pride to save me. The cross above the altar blurred into white, and the music stopped mid-breath as my body surrendered to gravity. Darkness returned. It came in fragments, sirens bleeding into whispered prayers, bright lights flickering against stone walls that had only known calm Sundays. Faces hovered above me, frightened and pale, their mouths moving before sound reached my ears. Someone kept saying my name, louder each time, and I wanted to answer, to reassure them, to tell them it was nothing more than dizziness. But my chest felt tight and unfamiliar, as though it no longer trusted me to breathe without effort. They lifted me onto a stretcher and rolled me through the heavy church doors into blinding daylight. And as the sky filled my vision, I had the strangest, smallest thought. I forgot to turn off the stove. It is unsettling how ordinary concerns cling to you, even when your heart may be failing. The hospital was colder than I expected, not in temperature but in precision. Wires were pressed to my skin, machines began marking time with steady beeps. Nurses asked questions that demanded clarity from a mind that felt fogged and distant. A doctor leaned over me, composed but alert, and asked the question that suddenly seemed more frightening than any test result. Is there someone we should call? For a moment I hesitated, not because I lacked an answer, but because of how much weight that answer carried. My son, I said finally, my voice thinner than I intended. He sighed and dialed while I watched his face instead of the ceiling. The phone rang, no response. He tried again, adjusting the receiver slightly, as though angle could influence outcome. I told myself not to worry, that my son works long hours, that meetings stretch late, that phones get buried in pockets and briefcases. By the time they moved me upstairs into a private room, more than 20 calls had been made. Messages were left, calm at first, then more urgent, each one explaining that I had collapsed, that I was stable but under observation, that it was important he call back. Settled outside the narrow hospital window when the doctor returned and pulled a chair beside my bed. His tone was careful. I've tried 40 times, he said quietly. 40? The number did not sound angry, it sounded tired. 40 attempts, 40 rings echoing into silence. The heart monitor beside me continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to human absence. I forced a faint smile and defended my son without thinking, because that is what parents do even when doubt begins to whisper. He must be tied up, I said. He'll see it soon. He nodded, but there was a pause before he stood up. A pause just long enough to feel deliberate. Later that night, he returned with test results and an explanation that my heart had been under significant strain for months, perhaps longer than I realized. That collapsing in a crowded church may have saved my life because if it had happened at home alone, the outcome could have been far worse. I listened carefully, absorbing each word, but beneath the medical clarity, something else was taking shape, something less clinical and far more personal. 40 calls do not vanish unnoticed. They accumulate, they glow against a screen. They insist. Morning arrived quietly, pale light stretching across the floor as hope rearranged itself inside me. I imagined my son rushing through the hospital doors, apologetic and shaken, explaining that his phone had been on silent, that he had been trapped in a meeting, that there was some ordinary, forgivable reason behind the silence. I rehearsed forgiveness before hearing an excuse. It is easier to prepare to. By midday, the doctor stepped into my room again, his expression different this time, more measured. I requested a wellness check, he explained gently, just to be certain. For a moment, fear replaced disappointment, sharp and protective. Perhaps something had happened to my son. Perhaps the silence had not been a choice at all. The doctor cleared his throat. He's safe, he said. Relief washed through me so quickly it almost made me dizzy again. Then he continued slower. Officers spoke to him directly. He said he's been busy and hasn't had a chance to check his voicemail. Such an efficient word for such a wide distance. I nodded, trying to let it settle, but the doctor did not move toward the door. He hesitated, as though debating whether to add something more. They mentioned, he said carefully, that when they arrived, his phone was in his hand. It was active. Active. Have. Them he hadn't looked closely at the notifications, the doctor added, almost apologetically. At the blanket folded neatly over my legs and felt something subtle shift inside me. Not an explosion, not anger, just a fine crack running through years of explanations I had made on his behalf. We had not argued recently. There had been no shouting, no dramatic fallout, just shorter calls, fewer visits, messages answered hours later instead of minutes. I had told myself that adulthood demands space, that independence creates silence. But independence does not erase 40 missed calls from a hospital. He asked if there was anyone else he should contact, a sibling, a close friend, someone who might come sit beside me. I opened my mouth and then closed it. Over time, when you invest everything into one person, the rest of your world grows quiet. As the sky outside dimmed into gray, and the machine beside me continued counting each fragile beat, I stopped asking why he had not answered. A different question rose instead, heavier and far more unsettling. If his phone had been in his hand, what had he seen on the screen, and what had he felt in that moment? Annoyance, indifference, hesitation. Something else. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of my heart echoing through plastic and wires, and for the first time since I collapsed, my fear was no longer centered on whether my body would recover. It was about what the silence might mean. Rings can be an accident. What he thought I wanted. By the second night, the hospital room no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt observant, as if the walls themselves were quietly watching to see whether I would keep making excuses or finally allow the truth to settle. I lay there listening to the rhythm of the heart monitor and realized something uncomfortable. I was not waiting for my son to arrive anymore. I was waiting to understand what he believed he was avoiding. That shift did not feel dramatic. It felt slow, heavy. I had spent a lifetime interpreting his silences kindly. Now I wasn't sure I could afford to. The cardiologist returned with a different tone in his voice. My condition had stabilized, he said, but only temporarily. There was a narrowing they were concerned about, pressure that had likely built for months. We can't postpone intervention for long, he explained, showing me a scan filled with shadows and thin lines that looked more fragile than I felt. If the rhythm slips again, it may not correct itself next time. The phrase lingered in the air longer than necessary. Not correct itself next time. He mentioned a procedure scheduled for the following day, minimally invasive but not without risk at my age. Consent forms would need signing, ideally by family. Eyes drifted to the empty chair beside my bed. I'll sign, I said quietly, though the pen felt heavier than it should have when they placed it in my hand. Leaving, he added something almost casually. We attempted another call this morning. It rang several times, then went to voicemail. He paused. A few minutes later, the hospital line received a call back. Breath caught, but it disconnected before we could answer, he continued. No message left. Seemed to tilt slightly, though I was perfectly still, so he had called back, at least once. The doctor showed me the log briefly before sliding the phone away. A missed return call. Duration, 3 seconds. Seconds. Long enough to press dial, not long enough to speak. The nurse later brought me my personal belongings, including my phone. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked it. Still nothing from him. No text asking if I was all right. No apology for missed calls. No explanation. I opened our message thread and scrolled upward slowly, as if moving back in time might reveal where the fracture began. His replies had grown shorter over the past year, practical and efficient. Busy? Later. We'll see. Words trimmed of warmth. I found it. 2 nights before I collapsed, I had written, "We need to talk when you have time." I remembered sending it, sitting alone at my kitchen table with an envelope open beside me. It was from the property developer who had been circling my house for months, offering more money each time. The latest offer had been unusually high. I had stared at that number for a long time. I had thought about calling my son to discuss it. I had thought about telling him that I was considering selling, simplifying, maybe moving somewhere smaller where the stairs would not feel so steep. It showed as delivered, it showed as read. No reply. Let the memory unfold further. A week earlier, during a brief phone call, he had asked a strange question. Have you updated your will recently? He had said, almost casually, as if asking about the weather. I had laughed it off. Why are you asking something like that? He had shrugged through the phone. Just practical, you never know. At the time, I dismissed it as adult responsibility. Now, lying in a hospital bed with a strained heart and a missed return call lasting 3 seconds, it replayed differently. Afternoon, something else happened that I could not ignore. The nurse entered my room holding a clipboard. There's a gentleman asking about your condition, she said. He called the main desk. Said he was connected to your family. My pulse quickened. My son? I asked. She hesitated. No, he didn't give that name. He mentioned something about property documentation. The envelope on my kitchen table. The offer I had not yet discussed with my son. The message I had sent that read, we need to talk. Line began connecting itself in my mind, stretching between the unread urgency of 40 calls and the possibility of a financial decision he assumed was coming. Had he seen my message and concluded I was about to complicate his future? Had he believed the hospital's number was not about my health, but about paperwork, about pressure, about responsibility? Arrived with heavier air than before. The cardiologist stopped by once more to review the procedure details. He mentioned again that my heart rhythm had fluctuated earlier in the day, briefly, dangerously, before correcting itself. You were fortunate, he said. It doesn't always stabilize twice. His words were not dramatic, but they were real. I stared at my phone again and opened social media for reasons I cannot fully explain. There he was, my son. An hour earlier, he had posted a photo at a restaurant, smiling beside colleagues, captioned, finally closing this deal. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with arteries. Stamp overlapped with the hospital's missed return call. Seconds. Enough to dial. Suddenly, the silence no longer felt accidental. It felt managed, balanced carefully between acknowledgement and avoidance, as if he wanted to show he had responded without actually stepping into whatever conversation awaited him. Phone down slowly and folded my hands over the blanket. For the first time since collapsing in that church, fear took a different shape. Not fear of dying, not even fear of surgery. That my son believed I was about to become a problem. Tomorrow morning, they would wheel me into a procedure that might determine how many more Sundays I would see. And somewhere out there, my son had seen my message, seen the hospital's calls, dialed back for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of silence. The morning of the procedure arrived without drama, which somehow made it more frightening. No alarms, no frantic rushing, just a nurse drawing the blinds halfway to let pale light spill across the floor, as if this were any ordinary Tuesday. But nothing about that morning felt ordinary to me. My heart had stumbled twice during the night, I was told, brief, irregular surges that corrected themselves before becoming catastrophic. It's unpredictable, the cardiologist said carefully. That's what concerns us. Unpredictable. A word that belongs to storms, not to the steady beating inside your chest. As they prepared the paperwork at the foot of my bed, I kept thinking about those 3 seconds. A return call long enough to prove awareness, too short to offer comfort. Wheeled me downstairs, I asked for my phone one last time. I don't know what I expected to see. A message, perhaps, a missed call, an apology that arrived too late but still mattered. Instead, there was nothing new from him. The last thing in our thread remained my message: we need to talk when you have time. It looked harmless on the screen, polite, almost gentle, and yet somehow it had built a wall tall enough to block 40 calls from a hospital. Really guided my bed through the corridor, ceiling lights sliding past like slow-moving stars. I remembered something small but unsettling. 2 months ago, my son had insisted on helping me organize my documents. It's better if everything's in one place, he had said, flipping through folders with a focus that felt unusually intense. He had asked detailed questions about the house, about outstanding taxes, about the original purchase papers. At the time, I had been touched by his sudden practicality. I told friends he was becoming responsible, thinking ahead. Now, moving toward a procedure that might decide how much time I had left, those questions replayed differently in my mind. The operating room, the air was colder, sharper. Bright lights hovered above me, and strangers in masks spoke in low, efficient voices. The anesthesiologist leaned close and explained the process, reassuring but firm. You may feel pressure, he said, but you shouldn't feel pain. I almost laughed at that. There are many kinds of pain that do not respond to anesthesia. Medication began to take effect. My thoughts drifted in and out like someone turning a radio dial. I saw flashes of my son as a child, small hands gripping mine while crossing the street, his first bicycle wobbling beneath him, his proud grin the day he signed his first job contract. I remembered how fiercely I had protected him from disappointment, how quickly I stepped in whenever life felt too heavy for him. Somewhere along the way, perhaps I had carried too much for too long. It's closed in, soft and heavy. When I woke, the room was dim and quiet, the procedure apparently complete. A dull ache lingered in my chest, but the sharpest sensation was disorientation. For a few seconds, I did not remember where I was, and then it all rushed back church, collapse, 40 calls, 3 seconds. A nurse noticed my eyes open and smiled gently. It went well, she said. You're stable, stable, another word that sounded temporary. Followed and asked the question I had promised myself I wouldn't ask immediately. Did my son call? Hesitated just slightly. There was a call from him, she said carefully. My heart skipped. He asked if the procedure had been completed. The pause that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. He did not ask to speak with you. He said he would check in later. Inside me grew very. Hours passed. I drifted between sleep and awareness, the anesthesia wearing off slowly, leaving behind a strange clarity. At some point, the cardiologist visited and confirmed the procedure had relieved some pressure, but warned that my heart remained vulnerable. Stress is not your friend, he added gently. I almost smiled at the understatement. Afternoon, I reached for my phone again. This time there was a text, not from my son directly, but in the family group chat he rarely used. Hope everything's handled, he had written. Let me know if paperwork needs my signature. Paperwork, not are you okay? Not how are you feeling, just paperwork. Stared at the screen until the words blurred. For the first time, a different possibility surfaced, one I had avoided because it felt almost disloyal to consider. What if my son believed that my message, we need to talk, was about transferring ownership, about obligations, about tying him to responsibilities he did not want? What if every missed call from the hospital confirmed a fear in him, not of losing me, but of being pulled into something permanent? Settled slowly, and the quiet of the hospital pressed in again. I replayed the nurse's words. He asked if the procedure had been completed, not how I was, not whether I had been frightened, just whether it was done. Finalized. My survival were a task to be checked off. The realization did not arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. There is a difference between someone who cannot answer and someone who calculates when to answer, between someone who is overwhelmed and someone who is measuring involvement. My eyes and let the steady rhythm of the monitor anchor me. My heart was still fragile, still healing, but it was beating on its own, without his presence, without his reassurance. For the first time, that felt significant. If he had been afraid that answering those calls would tie him to decisions he did not want to make, then he did not yet understand something crucial. The conversation I needed to have was not about giving him more. The question he was afraid to answer. The morning after my procedure did not feel triumphant, it felt clear, and clarity can be more unsettling than pain. The dull ache in my chest was manageable, the monitors beside me steady, but something deeper had shifted during the night. I had spent 2 days wondering why my son did not answer. Now, I was beginning to understand that the more important question was not why he stayed silent, but what he believed that silence was protecting him from. That realization did not bring peace, it brought focus. came, it was soft and measured, not the hurried knock of someone terrified, but the controlled knock of someone rehearsing composure. I knew it was him before the door opened. There is a rhythm to your child's presence that does not disappear with age. The cardiologist glanced toward the entrance, then back at me, reading something in my expression. I'll give you a moment, he said quietly, stepping out as the door opened. Stood there with his usual precision, jacket pressed, phone in hand, posture straight as if walking into a business meeting rather than a hospital room. His eyes moved quickly, assessing the machines, the IV line, the chair beside the bed. You look better than I expected, he said, offering a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Still here, I replied. He stepped inside but remained standing. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence felt different from before, less fragile, more revealing. I tried calling back, he said finally, sliding his phone into his pocket. I just needed to understand what was happening. Seconds, I answered gently. A flicker crossed his face. I was in the middle of something important, he said. When I saw that many calls from an unknown number, I assumed, he trailed off. Assumed what? I asked. That you were about to tell me something significant, he said carefully. You texted me that we needed to talk. Then a hospital keeps calling. You can see how that connects. To what? I pressed. To decisions, he replied, tension creeping into his tone. About the house, about transferring things, about putting responsibilities on me without discussing it first. Again, but this time something underneath it sounded less like greed and more like fear. I studied him more closely. The dark circles under his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as if holding something back. Is that what worried you? I asked quietly. That I might change something. Tailed sharply. You don't understand what I'm dealing with right now. I said. He hesitated, then finally pulled the chair closer and sat down, though his posture remained rigid. I'm stretched thin, he admitted, voice lower now. The business deal I closed yesterday wasn't a celebration, it was survival. I took on investors. If things collapse, I'm personally liable. I've been juggling loans you don't even know about. He ran a hand through his hair, something I had not seen him do since he was young. When you said we needed to talk, I thought maybe you were going to tell me you'd already signed something with that developer, or that you were expecting me to manage the sale, or handle taxes, or restructure ownership. I can't absorb another obligation right now. This did not excuse the silence, but they complicated it. So when the hospital called, I said slowly, you thought it was about paperwork. It was about decisions I wasn't ready to make, he corrected. Occur to you that it might be about my life? I asked, not angrily, just plainly. Down at his hands. You've always been strong, he said quietly. You've never been the one who collapses. Something tighten in my chest, not medically, but emotionally. Strength can be a disguise that robs you of urgency. I couldn't breathe, I told him. They thought my heart might stop. Expression shifted then, finally, visibly. The confidence cracked. I didn't know it was that serious, he said, and this time it sounded less defensive, more shaken. By the time I understood, I was already in the middle of negotiations. If I stepped out, everything would have fallen apart. Had, I asked. The question hung between us, heavier than any accusation. He swallowed but did not answer immediately. The monitor beside me filled the silence with steady. He leaned back slightly, thinking, then how would he know? I sent him a message asking for more details about his offer the same night I texted you, I said. Perhaps he grew impatient. It's returned, but now it carried a different weight. Not accusation, suspicion, not of each other, but of something wider. He was trying to move quickly because he heard you were hospitalized, my son asked slowly. What to think, I admitted. But I do know that when the hospital called you, you hesitated. Not because you didn't care, because you were afraid. Not deny it this time. I was afraid of being trapped, he said quietly, of inheriting complications I couldn't handle. I was afraid of dying alone, I replied. That was the first moment he truly looked at me, not at the machines, not at the paperwork implied in his imagination, but at me. His eyes softened, and beneath the calculation, I saw something far more human, something tired and overwhelmed. Thank you'd, he began, then stopped. Be vulnerable, I finished. He nodded faintly. Independence, on never asking for help, on making sure he felt free to build his own life without being tethered to mine. Perhaps I had succeeded too well. Calling to hand you burdens, I said gently. I was calling because I needed my son. Forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as if holding something fragile. I misread it, he admitted. I saw responsibility where there was fear. I saw silence where there was panic, I replied. The balance between us felt different now, less about accusation and more about revelation. The issue was no longer simply property or missed calls. It was the assumptions we had built about each other's strength and limitations. As a softer understanding began to form, another realization lingered beneath it, sharper and unresolved. If the developer had known about my hospitalization so quickly, and if my son had been negotiating a fragile financial deal at the same time, then there were threads connecting events that neither of us fully understood. 40 calls unanswered might be about fear. The clause no one was meant to read. That night, after my son left with a promise to return in the morning, I lay awake staring at the thin strip of light beneath the hospital door, replaying every conversation from the last 48 hours. Something about the developer's urgency did not sit right, and the more I turned it over in my mind, the heavier it felt. People who care about your health ask how you're breathing, how you're sleeping, whether you're frightened. They do not ask whether you are capable of signing documents. They do not rush to confirm your mental clarity while you are still connected to machines. The timing was too precise, too aligned with my vulnerability. And precision like that rarely belongs to coincidence. When the hallway was still quiet, I asked the nurse to bring me my purse. Inside was the envelope I had folded and unfolded too many times over the past week. The offer had increased again, far above market value, dressed in polite language about community development and mutual benefit. I had told myself the generosity was strategic, that perhaps the land was more valuable than I realized. But now, lying in a hospital bed with a heart that had nearly stopped cooperating, I saw something else in that number. Not generosity, leverage. His office before breakfast. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and carefully concerned. Mrs. Carter, I was just thinking about you, he said. I heard about your condition. I hope you're recovering well. Informed you I was hospitalized? I asked calmly. There was a breath barely audible. Oh, you know how small communities are, he replied lightly. News travels. Told quickly, I said. Someone from your office contacted the hospital asking whether I was fit to sign legal documents. That seems premature. It's lingered a fraction longer this time. Our investors are prepared to move forward, he explained, shifting into business language. We simply needed assurance that there would be no complications if you decided to proceed. I decided. The phrasing was careful, but the pressure was unmistakable. I have not agreed to anything, I said evenly, and I will not discuss property matters while I am under medical supervision. Of course, he responded too quickly. Take all the time you need. Ended, but the unease did not. Later that afternoon, my son arrived earlier than expected, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. He sat down without waiting to be invited, and for a moment he simply watched the monitor beside my bed as though measuring something intangible. He called me, he said quietly. Developer, I asked. He nodded. He said he was concerned about the deal losing momentum. He mentioned investors again. He implied that if we didn't act soon, the offer might be reduced. And what did you tell him? I asked. That nothing would move forward without you reviewing everything first, he said. Then he hesitated. He also said something else. He did. We sat side by side on that narrow hospital bed, scrolling through pages of dense legal language that seemed designed to exhaust the eyes before reaching the important parts. It took several minutes before we found the section neither of us had truly studied before. A contingency clause, buried beneath financial projections and renovation timelines, stating that in the event of temporary medical incapacity, authority to manage and finalize preliminary arrangements could be transferred to a designated administrative partner to prevent delay. The designated name was not mine. It was not my son's, affiliated with the developer. Moment, neither of us spoke. He was positioning himself to control the transition if you were declared unfit, my son said finally, his voice lower than before. Even temporarily. I could object, I added quietly. My heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the deeper instability in the room. The missed calls felt different. The urgency, the timing, the repeated emphasis on clarity and speed. If I had signed anything under pressure, if I had been declared medically incapable during recovery, control might have shifted without either of us fully realizing the implications. Whether you'd updated your will, my son said slowly, as though remembering something he had tried to dismiss. He said it was smart to have everything aligned before major transactions. Didn't concern you? I asked gently. It does now. Hospital, he looked not defensive, not calculating, but unsettled. I thought he was just being aggressive, he admitted. I didn't realize he was building safeguards for himself. Self, I echoed. Silence settled again, but it was no longer the silence of misunderstanding. It was the silence of shared awareness. It collapsed publicly, my son said quietly, if no one had intervened immediately, and if paperwork had been presented while you were weak. Not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Vulnerability invites acceleration, and acceleration benefits whoever moves first. Unanswered calls had nearly kept us divided long enough for someone else to step in. The laptop gently and rested my hands over the blanket. You were afraid I was about to burden you, I said softly, and I was afraid you had chosen not to care. Me then truly looked, and something unspoken passed between us. Seems, I continued, someone else was counting on both of us misreading the situation. Exhaled slowly. He underestimated one thing. The day we stopped reacting. The morning after we uncovered the clause felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but steadier. There is a particular shift that happens when confusion turns into awareness, when fear stops spinning in circles and begins walking in a straight line. I was still lying in a hospital bed with a fragile heart and a long recovery ahead. But for the first time since I collapsed in that church, I did not feel like the weakest person in the room. Someone had tried to move quickly while I was vulnerable. Someone had counted on silence. And silence, at last, had ended. Arrived before the nurses changed shifts, coffee in hand, jacket slightly wrinkled as though he had not slept much. He didn't open his laptop immediately this time. He sat down and looked at me for a long moment, studying my face as if recalibrating something in his mind. I've been going over the contract again, he said finally. There are more issues. He did. Appendix. he continued. If construction delays occur, and they almost always do, the purchase price can be renegotiated downward based on market fluctuation. He gave a short, humorless breath, which means the generous offer might not stay generous. Urgency was strategic, I said quietly. Yes, he replied. They needed your signature before the protections kicked in. Protections lingered between us. It sounded ironic now. Forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I spoke to a lawyer friend early this morning, he added. He says clauses like this are technically legal but ethically questionable, especially when tied to medical incapacity. Did he advise? I asked. To slow everything down, he said. To request independent evaluation and remove any transfer of control language entirely. Down. The opposite of everything the developer had been pushing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The monitor beside me continued its patient rhythm, and sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow lines across the floor. I realized something subtle but profound. 2 days ago, my son feared responsibility. Now he was voluntarily stepping into it. You an apology, he said suddenly. I looked at him, surprised by the directness. I assumed your message meant pressure, he continued. I assumed the hospital calls were about paperwork. I made it about my stress instead of your condition. His jaw tightened slightly. That was wrong. This did not come easily to him. I could hear that. I should have answered, he added. Yes, I said gently, you should have. He nodded once, accepting it. There was no dramatic embrace, no tears, no theatrical reconciliation. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something fragile had almost broken entirely. You tell me about the investors? I asked softly. He looked away for a moment. Because I didn't want you to worry, he admitted. You've always handled everything alone. I didn't want to look unstable. Smiled at the irony. We had both been protecting each other from fears we never voiced. Always look strong because I had to, I said, not because I never needed help. Absorbed that quietly. Later that afternoon, with the nurse's permission, we placed the developer on speaker and requested a meeting. Not in my home, not privately, but in the hospital conference room the following day, with my son present and a legal advisor joining by phone. The shift in tone was immediate. Necessary? The developer asked lightly when we outlined the arrangement. My son replied before I could speak. Very. There was a pause on the other end, then politeness returned, thinner than before. After my son left to prepare documents, I lay back against my pillows and let exhaustion settle over me. But beneath the physical fatigue was something steadier. I had nearly lost more than my breath that Sunday morning. I had nearly lost clarity. By the end of the meeting, the contract was tabled indefinitely. Amendments would be required. Independent valuation would be conducted. All incapacity clauses removed. Left, the conference room felt unusually quiet. He thought we wouldn't read it closely, my son said. He thought we wouldn't talk, I corrected. That was the real miscalculation. Back in my hospital room, as evening settled in, my son remained seated beside me longer than usual. He did not check his phone every few minutes. He did not glance at the door. He simply sat. Almost let fear make me careless, he said quietly. And I almost let pride keep me silent, I replied. We had both learned something uncomfortable. Responsibility is not a burden when it is chosen. It becomes a burden when it is avoided until it grows teeth. Lights dimmed and the hallway quieted, I realized something else had changed. What the silence was hiding. The night after he left the hospital room, sleep never truly arrived. It hovered near me like a visitor unsure whether it was welcome, drifting in and out while the machines beside my bed kept time with a body that still felt borrowed. And in that half awake state, I realized something unsettling. The silence I had been focusing on was never the whole story. Silence rarely is. It is usually a cover, a curtain drawn over something moving underneath. And the more I replayed his words, his posture, the way his eyes avoided the window when the house came up, the clearer it became that my collapse had not interrupted his life. It had collided with something already breaking inside it, something he hadn't come to confess, only to manage, only to contain. The doctor spoke carefully, the way people do when they don't want to alarm you but also don't want to lie. My heart had stabilized but not forgiven me. Stress leaves fingerprints even when it pretends not to. And as she spoke, I found myself nodding while my attention drifted elsewhere, to the way fear makes people practical, how panic often disguises itself as efficiency. And for the first time, I asked myself a question that hurt more than the unanswered calls. What if he wasn't avoiding me? What if he was drowning and didn't trust himself to speak without revealing it? Did not arrive gently. It arrived in fragments. A nurse mentioning a call from a law office asking whether I was conscious enough to sign documents, the wrong name attached to my room number. A pause when I said I hadn't requested anything. And then later, much later, a folded pamphlet left on the tray with my lunch, foreclosure counseling, placed there by mistake, or maybe not a mistake at all. And in that moment, something shifted, because mistakes don't repeat themselves with that kind of precision. They circle, they hover, they wait to be noticed. For my phone, then, not to call him, not yet, but to search quietly, the way you do when you're afraid of what confirmation might cost you. And it didn't take long, panic leaves trails. Overdue notices disguised as polite reminders. Legal language softened with concern, dates lining up too neatly to ignore. And there it was, the reason the house had become urgent. The reason 40 calls felt dangerous instead of comforting. The reason he had walked into my room, already braced for bad news, because he believed I was about to pull the last solid thing out from under him. It was not the debt itself. Lives unravel in ways we don't plan. What hurt was realizing that in his fear, he had rewritten our relationship into a transaction, that he had seen my vulnerability not as a moment to show up, but as a risk to be mitigated. And yet, even as that realization settled, it refused to turn into anger. It turned into something quieter and more complicated. The understanding that people do not always become cruel when they are scared. Sometimes they just become smaller, narrower, unable to see past the next consequence. Noon, I asked the doctor how long before I could be discharged. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the timing, but gave me an answer anyway. And as she spoke, I felt a strange calm return, not the fragile calm of acceptance, but the steadier calm of preparation. Because now I knew what the silence had been hiding, and knowing changes everything. It turns confusion into direction, pain into strategy. And as I stared out the window at a world that kept moving without any awareness of the decisions forming inside that quiet hospital room, I understood that the next conversation would not be about the house, or the debt, or even the missed calls. It would be about truth, and whether he was ready to hear it. Because the next thing I did would decide the thing I never told him. When I was discharged 3 days later, the air outside the hospital felt thinner than I remembered, not because of my heart, but because clarity changes how the world presses against you. And as my son helped me into the passenger seat of his car, adjusting it carefully, almost cautiously, I watched his hands and saw what I had missed before. The tremor was subtle but real, a quiet fracture beneath the surface of composure. And in that moment, I understood something essential. He had not been calculating, he had been cornered. Home was unusually quiet, not tense, not hostile, just heavy with things waiting to be said. And as we pulled into the driveway of the house that had somehow become both sanctuary and bargaining chip, I felt the weight of memory settle around us. The porch he learned to ride a bicycle in front of, the window he once broke with a baseball and swore was an accident, the doorframe where I had marked his height in pencil until he surpassed me, and I realized that whatever financial panic he was facing, this house was not just an asset to him, it was proof of continuity, proof that something in his life had remained stable even when he had not. The silence was different from the hospital silence. This one was familiar, layered with years. And as he set my bag down and began moving through rooms, checking small things as if he were inspecting for damage, I saw the pattern clearly. He wasn't preparing to take control, he was preparing for loss. He had been bracing himself for the possibility that I would sell the house, pay medical bills, simplify my life, and leave him standing on ground that was already shifting beneath his feet. Down, I said finally, my voice steady enough that he obeyed without argument. And when he sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we had once argued about curfews and college applications and curiously expensive textbooks, I did not begin with accusation. I began with truth. I know about the debt, I said quietly. Reaction was immediate, not anger, not denial, but exposure. The kind that drains color from a face before words can arrive, and for a moment he looked younger than he had in years, caught between pride and exhaustion. You weren't supposed to find out like that, he said, his voice lower than I had ever heard it. Supposed to collapse in church either, I replied gently, and something in that simple comparison shifted the room, because both events had stripped away illusion, both had revealed fragility neither of us had planned to display. Plain then, not defensively, not strategically, but honestly, how one investment had failed, how a temporary bridge loan had turned permanent, how pressure compounds when you're trying to solve it alone, and how the developer's offer had seemed like an answer disguised as opportunity. Not greed, not inheritance calculation, but survival. And as he spoke, I listened without interruption, because what he needed in that moment was not correction. It was acknowledgement. If you sold, he hesitated, then met my eyes. Then I didn't know what I was going to do. Was the truth the silence had been protecting, not indifference, not calculation, fear. Quiet stretch, not as punishment, but as space for him to feel the weight of what had almost happened. And then I told him the thing I had never told him before, the thing I had kept folded away like an old letter, believing strength meant withholding vulnerability. The house was never going to solve your problems, I said softly, and it was never meant to be your safety net. Expression shifted, confusion replacing dread. I already changed my will months ago, I continued, watching the realization settle slowly. The house is placed in a living trust. It cannot be sold under pressure, and it cannot be transferred without my direct consent while I'm alive. Absorbing it, you didn't tell me. No, I said, because I thought telling you would make you feel secure without forcing you to build your own security. Were not cruel, but they were firm, and I let them stand. I love you, I added, because truth without compassion becomes a weapon. But love does not mean insulating you from consequence. It means standing beside you while you face it. For a long moment he said nothing, and then the tension in his shoulders loosened in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager who had just confessed to something difficult. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, not desperation, not relief, but responsibility. Then I need to fix this, he said quietly. I replied, you do. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, ordinary, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening inside that kitchen. And as I leaned back in my chair, feeling the steady rhythm in my chest, I understood something with clarity that almost felt like grace. The silence between us had not been about property, or contracts, or signatures. It had been about fear of disappointing each other. And fear thrives in isolation. It grows in the space where conversations are postponed and assumptions are allowed to harden. Unanswered calls had nearly fractured us permanently. A single honest conversation when silence loses its power. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no shouting matches in the driveway, no final confrontations with raised voices or slammed doors, just a steady series of decisions made in daylight. And sometimes that is how real change happens, not with spectacle, but with repetition, with small actions that quietly replace old patterns. And as I moved slowly through the house, still aware of the careful rhythm inside my chest, I noticed something that mattered more than any contract we had voided. My son no longer avoided the difficult topics. He initiated them. Meetings that had once seemed urgent, he called his lenders instead of dodging them. He asked questions instead of pretending he already had answers. And one evening, sitting across from me with papers spread out between us, he said something that would have been impossible a week earlier. I made this worse by trying to look stable. And there was no defensiveness in his voice, only recognition, and recognition is the first form of responsibility. Called twice more, polite but distant now, his tone no longer confident, the leverage gone. And when my son answered the final call on speaker, his words were calm and unambiguous. "We won't be moving forward," he said. And there was no tremor this time, no hesitation, just clarity. And when the line disconnected, the house felt lighter, not because its value had changed, but because it was no longer being measured against panic. Afternoon, a week after I returned home, we sat on the porch together, watching late sunlight stretch across the street. And for the first time since my collapse, we spoke about something other than contracts or clauses or debt. We spoke about the years in between, the quiet misunderstandings that had accumulated like dust, the ways we had both confused independence with distance. And I realized something that surprised me. My heart had not faltered because of stress alone. It had faltered because I had been carrying too much alone for too long. And strength, when isolated, becomes strain. "You didn't need me anymore," he admitted softly, eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on me. "You didn't want to," I replied. There it was, the simplest truth in the entire story. Not greed, not inheritance anxiety, not manipulation, but two people misreading each other's silence, building narratives where conversations should have been. And I felt a quiet ache for how easily it could have ended differently, how 40 unanswered calls might have remained unanswered, how a signature under pressure could have changed everything, how pride could have calcified into permanent distance. We were here, not perfect, not magically repaired, but aware, and awareness changes the trajectory of a relationship more than apologies ever could. As I prepared for bed, I paused in the hallway and looked at the doorframe where pencil lines still marked his growth from childhood, uneven and faded but visible. And I realized the house had never been about walls or equity. It had been about continuity, about proof that something endured, and what nearly broke us was not financial risk, it was emotional assumption. It had power only while it was unchallenged. Once questioned, once spoken into, it lost its grip. Turning off the lights, I checked my phone out of habit. And there, in the quiet glow of the screen, was a message from him sent just minutes earlier from the other room. Not because he needed something, not because there was paperwork to review, but because sometimes simple things deserve to be said out loud, even in text. "Thank you for not giving up on me," it read. I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling the steady pulse in my chest, stronger now, consistent, earned, and I typed back slowly, choosing each word with care. "Never waiting for perfection," I wrote. "I was waiting for you to answer." And buzzed again almost instantly, as if this time there was no hesitation between thought and response. "Here," he replied. And for the first time since that Sunday morning when the world narrowed and my heart forgot its rhythm, I understood the ring that was answered. 6 months later, the house looks almost the same from the outside. The same pale paint, the same porch rail that still needs sanding, the same tree in the yard leaning slightly toward the street as if listening to passing conversations. And yet everything inside it feels different. Not because furniture was replaced or walls were repainted, but because something invisible shifted, something far more structural than wood or brick. And sometimes the most permanent renovations are the ones no one can photograph. Is steadied now, not perfectly, not without reminders, but strong enough to carry me up the stairs without pausing midway, strong enough to walk to church again without the quiet fear of collapse following every step. And each time my phone rings, I notice something instinctive. I no longer brace myself for disappointment, because more often than not, it is him. Solve everything overnight. Debt does not disappear because of a single honest conversation, and pride does not dissolve simply because it has been exposed. But he faced it. He restructured what he could, sold what he needed to, took on work he once believed was beneath him. And somewhere in the process, something far more valuable than financial stability returned to him: the ability to look me in the eye without calculation behind it. Never called again after the contract was formally withdrawn. Word travels quietly in small communities, especially when investors realize clauses are being scrutinized instead of signed blindly. And I sometimes wonder how many other homes changed hands under the weight of urgency, how many signatures were placed on paper in moments of vulnerability. But I no longer carry anger about it. That chapter ended the moment we chose clarity over fear. Afternoon, as autumn began settling in, my son arrived with a ladder and a can of fresh paint. Without ceremony, without speech, he began repainting the front door. I watched from the porch swing as the old color disappeared beneath steady strokes, and when he stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag, the door looked brighter, not dramatically different, just renewed, intentional. "Did a reset," he said simply. "So did we." Together on the porch as the light faded, and he told me something I had not expected. "I used to think responsibility meant protecting myself first," he said quietly. "Now I think it means answering when it's uncomfortable." Grand apology attached to it. No emotional performance, just understanding. And I realized then that growth rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself in behavior, in consistency, in who shows up when there is nothing to gain. Going inside, he paused at the doorway and looked back at me. "If you ever call like that again," he said, half serious, half warning, "I'll be there." I smiled because this time the promise did not feel reactive, it felt rooted. Lying in my own bed, not a hospital one, I scrolled through my phone until I found the old call log, 40 missed attempts that once felt like evidence of abandonment. I did not delete them. I let them remain there as a reminder, not of betrayal, but of the distance we almost allowed to define us. Is simple. Silence grows powerful when we refuse to question it, when we let assumptions speak louder than words, when pride convinces us that reaching out twice is weakness and reaching out 40 times is foolish. But the day silence is answered, truly answered, it loses its authority. Still stands, the door is newly painted. My heart still beats, steady and deliberate. When the phone rings, it is no longer a test of who will move first. Simply a reminder that love is not proven in inheritance, not secured in contracts, not preserved in property, but in something much smaller and much harder to do.